what I want to do is a little bit today, before we get too involved in talking about 1 Samuel, the first of our history books, I want to build a theological context and a little bit of a historical context for how we might approach this book. And this will be an echo from last fall. A lot of you enjoyed this kind of topic, this idea. I'm a big, as I read the Old Testament and the New, and I really appreciate the theological continuity between the Old and the New Testament. Also, within the books of the Old Testament, I appreciate and see all over the place strong evidence of divine inspiration. You've got authors, contributing at various times in history, and you find these authors, whether they be a historian or a prophet or a poet, bringing together theological themes that line up in pretty amazing ways. Now, there's a big idea that I want to make sure that we grasp, and I introduced this last fall, but I want to bring it back again because it's helpful for kind of launching out into a discussion of these history books. Interestingly, our author of 1 Samuel is asking some of the same questions that we've already heard. And they're the same kinds of questions that the biblical authors of the Old Testament all ask. And one of the big ideas has to do with this, what I call the bookends of the Old Testament. So if you remember, we talked about, and if you want to turn to the book of Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah, and I want to pull a few things out of the prophet Zechariah because Zechariah represents one of the last voices, the last contributors to the salvation history in the Old Testament. He's a post-exilic prophet. That means he's speaking to an audience who's come out of exile. They've come back under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah. They're back in Jerusalem. They've rebuilt the walls of the city, the temple, and now they're having church. So these prophets like Zechariah and Haggai, for example, are raised up by God to encourage this group. And we have some pretty significant encouragement that comes from Zechariah in the very last chapter, 14. And that's what I want to look here first. Oftentimes, the prophets will bring up this topic, the day of the Lord. Whenever you see the day of the Lord being discussed in any prophetic book, it's probably the prophet turning to the faithful remnant as part of their audience and encouraging the faithful remnant. Oftentimes, prophets will turn to, the majority of unfaithful, and the message for them, it's judgment and a call to repentance. But there's also the faithful remnant group. They're asking a different set of questions. And in their context, their world is chaotic, turned upside down. They're saying, hey, has God given up on us yet? See, and the Zechariah is one of those prophets that says, no, the day of the Lord is coming. And here's what he says about the day of the Lord. Chapter 14, verse 1. Let's see, I might call on a few of you to read. And we want to get into a good practice this semester. This room is mic'd, not to get anybody in trouble, but we want to speak loudly and clearly and slowly when we read biblical text. How's that? So if I call on you, it's not to embarrass you, but when you do get called on, you might want to slow down and speak with your acting voice. Oh, by the way, I'm in a spring play. I don't know if I told you last fall. My wife and I oftentimes are part of a community theater group in Mansfield Community Theater. And guess what this guy is starring in this spring? The spring production of,
Chronicles of Narnia.
Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. How did you know?
From our church tried to get in.
Oh, are they in it?
Yeah, our little girl,
Oh, it has a lot of kids in it. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah, Lucy's got a pretty significant role. A lot of lines to memorize. But this guy and my wife were Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. We have a lot of lines too, but So I might make that, although it's kind of an unfair thing for the online students because a lot of them can't kind of like come to Mansfield to watch the play, but we'll come up with something different for you all to do for extra credit. But I might make it extra credit if you're all interested. If anybody wants to take the track over, maybe for a date night or something, or maybe for a first-time date. Or anyway, go over and watch me and my wife in this play. I'll give you the dates and the times for it, and you can do a theological analysis of Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. I mean, and it's kind of neat. The gal who leads the community theater does it and she's a Christian. It's a neat group of people. That's why we do it. It's kind of fun to do together, and it's really, really neat people. A lot of them are involved in church and stuff, but this play we get to do for all of the fourth graders in the entire Mansfield school district. Like 4,000, I think 3,000 to 4,000. We packed this auditorium called Willie Pig, and it's just packed of students, and they're all being exposed to some good Christian, in this case, C.S. Lewis book, and it's kind of cool. And they talk about it, and their teachers, they do the analysis and talk about it, and it's kind of a neat thing. So where was I going with that? That was a huge rabbit trail. So we've got Zechariah. Let's take a look, and he is encouraging his group with the day of the Lord, and you see it in verse 1. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you will be divided among you. Really, we get to kind of the themes that I want to introduce. This day of the Lord, verse 6, this day will come about in that day that there will be no light, the luminaries will dwindle, for it will be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but will come about that at evening time there will be light. And it will come about in that day that living waters, that's an interesting theme, will flow out of Jerusalem, half of them towards the eastern sea and the other half toward the western sea, and it will be summer as well as in winter. And, this is the key verse here, that goes with verse 8, and the Lord will be king over all of them. Speaking of Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, in that day the Lord will be the only one, and his name the only one. So let's take kind of the combination of verses 8 and 9, and we've got this day of the Lord. Pardon me if I don't write as clearly, but is that coming up on the big screen? Really? I wanted to get my right proportion. I'll just do it right here. All right, so day of the Lord. Now, there's three things. The first one is God. You see it right there. God is king. That's going to be huge. And then this reference to the fact that not only is God king, but the implication of that is his name, a.k.a. one. One name. I should have put one name first. And then 3, this reference to the living water here, that's going to be this broader category of the H2O or the water. That's this idea of blessing, life and blessing. That's going to extend from this location on the day of the Lord where God reigns as king and as a kind of an offshoot of the fact that he's on the throne reigning will be this extension of life and blessing, oftentimes here described as the water. And this is all part of the day of the Lord. So those 3 things. And we ask ourselves the question, if this is, God's divine agenda, wouldn't surprise us to find that maybe this shows up in other places in Scripture, these basic ideas. And you all know, I'm seeing some head shake. Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly, if we want to go back to one place that might not be as clear, let's go back to the very first book of the Old Testament, Genesis. And we want to find our other bookend. I say bookends because the bookends, the first bookend, the last bookend, and everything in between. Let's turn to the very first chapter, Genesis 1 and 2, and see what we can piece together there. And you're familiar with Genesis 1. We talked about it last fall, but most people are familiar with the creation narrative. God is creating. He's speaking into existence. He's establishing life. He's creating the domains, right, in which all living things express their created function and design. The pinnacle of creation, what we see in God creating is humanity, human beings, to be little kings. We talked about that idea. The image of God, Genesis 1:26 and 27, to bear the image of God is closely linked, as we said last fall, to this image of God-bearing responsibility in humanity, regardless of country of origin or color of skin or race or anything. All human beings bear the image of God. So that's carrying the name and bearing the name and the reputation. Name means reputation in the Old Testament context. So we're bearing the name, and we're carrying the name, the image, the reputation of the King as a function of our image of God bearing. And so that comes out of Genesis. Now, one of the things I want to show you here in Genesis chapter 2. So after all that is said in Genesis 1, we have a kind of a quick summary section here Moses gives us. Chapter 2, verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their hosts. And by the seventh day God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all of his work which God had created and made. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made heaven and earth. And here's what I want to point out. It's kind of subtle, but right there you've got all of this creation activity, and then what do we see? We see one who has done all of this, spoken all of this, commanded all of this, and then what does he do? He comes over and he sits and he rests. And when that happens, everything around him does the same. Who in the ancient world has the right to do something like that? What kind of ancient person would have the ability to do that, right? You see it? It's a king. And God, from the earliest chapters, and what Moses brings emphasis to, is only a king can do that. So God as king is established from the very, very get-go in the Old Testament, Genesis. So we go all the way back, Genesis 1. We'll just say Genesis. We have the same kinds of ideas showing up. If you follow me on that first one, and then we talked about a little bit the second one. So humanity is created to bear the image of God and to establish his name, his reputation. As a function of that image bearing, we've got the same thing going on there with the connection of name to image. Now the third one comes as a kind of is a little bit linked to this. But we know that in the creation of humanity, Adam's job description as an image bearer is what? 4 things, right? Fill, multiply, rule, and subdue. That's what humanity, that's what Adam was supposed to do. So as an image-bearing function, the implication of that is humanity, Adam and Eve, as a function of fill, multiply, rule, and subdue, are expanding the boundaries of the garden and access to the source of life, to the whole world. Israel, as a nation down the road, will understand their role as a nation is largely the same kind of thing. As Israel plants herself in the promised land, we know that through the Abrahamic covenant, right, that through Israel, through the nation Israel, blessing would be extended to all of the nations of the world. That's written into the covenant relationship. So you see these themes coming together. God is king, the implication of the name, the planting of the name. Israel, as a nation, planted herself as a nation in the promised land to plant the flag of Yahweh, to represent him, to mirror him and reflect his name, his image, his reputation to the watching nations. So that's going to be an important foundational peg as we evaluate how well Israel's doing as we get into the monarchy, as we get into the divided kingdom and all of those things. That's going to be kind of huge. So the extension of this blessing, the implication of Israel doing her job here is that this is happening for the nations. So now, what does all of this have to do with, let's see, what we're going to talk about? Before we take our first break, I want to expand this a little bit. We talked about, Moses developing this idea. I should go ahead and write down the words life and then blessing here. All right, so we have our bookends, the beginning and the end, and somewhere in between, what we want to do now is set a kind of a closer historical theological context for our first book, Samuel. Of course, Samuel, the book of Samuel, is going to introduce us to some faithful people. We're going to meet up with Hannah, and through the prayer of a faithful mother, introducing her son dedicated to service, Samuel, the prophet Samuel, who will eventually be used by God to bring about and make this transition from this 400-year period we call the book of Judges into this new thing of the monarchy. But there's a context that we want to build right before in this and talk a little bit more about this period of Judges. So the book of Judges, we looked at this last fall, and what's interesting about the book of Judges is that the author of Judges, remember we talked about these authors being not just historians, they're not all about writing the events, people, places, and things of the Old Testament, but they're also bringing in theology. They're bringing in theological evaluation of what's happening, people, places, things, and others. So the author of Judges, as we saw, introduces us to this 400-year period of spiritual chaos. We looked at the book of Judges, and every judge cycle gets a little bit more worse and a little bit more dark. It's a dark book, the book of Judges. You read it and you want to rip your hair out. You get to the end and you're saying, is this really happening? Could this be? What am I reading here? It's shock. It's kind of got some kind of a shock effect, and that's entirely what the author of Judges is trying to convey. He's evaluating this 400-year period through a theological lens. Interestingly, he gives us his thesis statement right at the end of his book. Let's take a look at the book of Judges and remind ourselves. Usually we think of thesis statements going in the introduction or at the very beginning. But the author of Judges in chapter 21 gives us his thesis statement at the very end. Actually in a couple different places, but right here at the end. And you know this, right? In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's the thesis statement. The whole book of Judges is his thesis that he's written to illustrate and demonstrate that thesis statement being true. So when you read Judges, you start with that thesis statement. You say, oh, yeah, he's made his point. Oh, he's made his point again. Oh, you have one more time. Boy, he really emphatically made his point with that story. Wow, did that really happen? Okay, you got me. I agree. No disagreement from me. It's kind of the effect that he's going after. So that's his thesis statement. What's interesting about that thesis statement is it lines up with our bookends. And it asks the question and focuses on this idea of king. And here's what I want to do with this. This is kind of still in, you might say, fresh and wet cement. But I want to show you and develop this a little bit. And I think there might be more going on with his question of his thesis statement. In other words, is the author of Judges merely trying to raise the question of boy, we sure do need a king. There was no king in Israel. Or is there something wrong with this picture? I'm looking. Some of you are looking at this picture. Okay. I'll explain this in just a little bit. Is the author of Judges just merely trying to say, wow, there's this chaotic period. Boy, if we had a king, things would sure be better. Is it that? Or can we say that the author of Judges is saying more than that? So here's what I'm doing in building my case. And I have to go into the ancient world a little bit and talk about this idea of killing a king. When you kill a king in the ancient world, it's not so much about cutting off his head and ending his life. But here's some language that we can pull. This is one example. Notice they killed him, drove him out of the land. He came to my father's presence. My father did not reject him. Killing a king in the ancient world doesn't so much mean ending his life, but it means two things. Dethronement. In other words, dethroning the king, and then driving him out of the land is what you see here. Combination of those two things. So this killing language that we see showing up. So you have to understand these are two kings. You have the suzerain king and the vassal king. We talked about suzerain-vassal relationships, how that kind of connects to the biblical idea of the covenant relationship. God being suzerain, Israel being vassal. God introducing Israel into a covenant relationship. At Mount Sinai, the introduction of the Ten Commandments and all of Moses' teaching that fills up the rest of the Pentateuch, constituting the job description of this newly formed nation. How do we express covenant relationship in the promised land? What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to have church? How are we supposed to deal with sin? How we raise our kids? How we eat? How do we not be like the pagans around us? All of that's in the Pentateuch. That's what Moses left with Joshua before they go into the conquest, the book of Joshua, and then into the period of that we were talking about here with the period of the Judges. All right, now's where it gets interesting. So Moses, let's go to his book and turn to Deuteronomy chapter 8. I know I'm jumping around a little bit here, but I really want to make this point and kind of lay this out because I think it'll really help all of us make these historical books come a little bit more alive. Moses is going to warn Israel before they get to the land in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 8, beginning in verse 11. Let's take a look. Actually, let's have somebody read for me here. Michael, why don't you read for us in the front here? Deuteronomy chapter 8, 11 down through 20. And if you want to read it in dramatically, like you would be Moses preaching this. By the way, if you read the Old Testament, especially the Pentateuch, read it out loud to yourself, even if your roommates are around, because they may need to hear it, and or your wife or your kids or whatever. But it sounds like it's preaching material, and that's exactly what it is. Moses is preaching. He's on the plains of Moab. The context for the book of Deuteronomy, preparation for the what next, entering the land, and these kinds of messages come alive when you're thinking that way. If I'm in that audience hearing this for the first time, how would I have responded? What are our concerns when we go to that place? So go ahead. Yeah.
11 through 20?
Yes, sir.
Be careful that you don't forget.
Read it a little bit louder.
Be careful that you don't forget the Lord your God by failing to keep his command, the ordinances and statutes I'm giving you today. When you eat and are full and build beautiful houses to live in, and your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold multiply, and everything else you have increases. Be careful that your heart doesn't become proud, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the place of slavery. He led you through the great and terrible wilderness with its poisonous snakes and scorpions, a thirsty land where there was no water. He brought water out of the flint-like rock for you. He fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers had not known, in order to humble and test you, so that in the end he might cause you to prosper. You may say to yourself, My power and my own ability have gained this wealth from you. But remember that the Lord your God gives you the power to gain wealth, in order to confirm his covenant he swore to your fathers, as it is today. If you ever forget the Lord your God, and go after other gods to worship and bow to them, I testify against you today that you will perish. Like the nations the Lord is about to destroy before you, you will perish if you do not obey the Lord your God.
Okay, so there's some language here I want to bring into this kind of this context of what it means to kill a king, i.e. dethrone and drive out from the land. You see, Moses is warning here the idea of forgetting Yahweh, and the largely happening in verse 19 with the displacement. Yahweh's being replaced. He's forgotten. And by the way, these pagan gods around, they look pretty appealing. Let's bring them in and have church. So this pagan influence was the threat that Moses had laid down. And this idea of forgetting God, I think that it's very closely related to this idea of dethronement. Dethrone. So this idea of dethroning the Lord means if we forget the Lord, we are forgetting that He's King. He's our suzerain. He's the King who has invited us into covenant relationship. So if we forget the covenant, we're forgetting Him, and we're dethroning Him. So this is part of the question. However, let's see, what do I want to do here? So it's kind of like talking to the hen because the face ain't listening. That's what I have there. But if we go to the book of Judges and we look at that thesis statement one more time, the book of Judges, and the author is saying there was no king in Israel. Everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. The connection that I make is this. I see that the author of Judges is looking at this whole 400-year period in the book of Judges, this historical period, and he's recognizing that Israel, for 400 years, has pretty much been acting like God was off the throne. They've dethroned Him. They've ignored Him, and according to Moses, they have forgotten Him. So I see some continuity there. I think that the author of the book of Judges is recognizing and bringing in this whole, his magnum opus. He's evaluating this 400-year period, and his thesis statement may be said this way: God was not on His throne. Everybody was doing whatever was right in their own eyes. And as we looked at Judges, we remember every single account that he unpacks is just a more illustration of that. It further illustrates. And that's what we have leading up to our first historical book that we're going to cover this semester, Samuel. And guess what question Samuel begins to wrestle with from the very beginning? The tension and question of God is king. It's going to come right back in, and the author of Samuel is going to bring us into that question as well. So this is the question that is going to show up. The question of, is God on the throne? Well, He should have been for this 400-year period. In fact, that was the case from the very, very beginning. God was supposed to be king, never to be off the throne. And what happens when God's people put Him off the throne? What is God obligated to do in response? And what will He do, as you know, with His own people? He'll dethrone them, and He'll exile them. So this harsh language that we see in Moses, in Deuteronomy 8, the word perish, sometimes you see it, the word destroy, means cease to exist as a nation. So the idea of killing a nation kind of comes into play. Israel as the vassal, and God as king in covenant relationship will dethrone his vassal and exile his vassal. And that will happen. And we'll see that history play out as we move ahead through these historical books, Samuel and Kings. By the time we get to the end of Kings, we'll see that this whole process has taken place. Israel has been dethroned, and she has been exiled, so she loses her land. So she ceased to exist as a nation. God's grace, as we know, allows for a faithful remnant, though, to come back after 70 years in exile with regards to Judah, and we'll get into that down the road. All right, so this is where we're going. An interesting question, though. Probably should take our break here. Let me just finish this really quick. This rethronement question, the idea of dethronement or rethronement, guess what group of individuals in the biblical context start to ask the rethronement question? Who would they be? Prophets, right? And the prophets, like what we saw here, Zechariah. Let me take you to one really quick. Let's turn to the dim bones, dry bones passage. And it's sad that most people, that's all they know about, Ezekiel 36. But let's turn to Ezekiel 36 and see this in a different kind of language. I'm sorry, Ezekiel 37. But you know the dry bones vision that Ezekiel receives. Remember, Ezekiel is a prophet who's raised up to encourage the exiles who are in Babylon, right? They're in Babylon, and over that 70-year period, God never gives up on the faithful remnant. Wherever they are, they exist. And even through this chaotic period of 400 years in the book of Judges, throughout the entire seemingly ongoing chaos through the time of the monarchy, divided kingdom, and that ongoing, bad king after bad king, as we'll see, there's a faithful remnant. God hasn't given up on them. And he raises up prophets to encourage them. And here's how Ezekiel does. They're in exile asking the question, we've been dethroned, Ezekiel. We have ceased to exist as a nation for the most part. We're on life support at best. We've lost our king. We've lost our temple. We have no place to have church, and we've lost our land. Is God given up on us? And we see in the vision of the dry bones, we'll pick it up with a little bit here in verse 15, after the vision of the sinews and the flesh coming back on these bones. There's this resurrection, this renewal that's being described, really focusing on the bringing together, the bringing back and the uniting of the formerly known as Israel, northern kingdom, southern kingdom, Judah, together into one. One united kingdom. And guess who's going to be their king? He's focusing now, Ezekiel, on the rethronement. Do you see that? In verse 24. Well, let's look at verse 22. Oh, this is all good. Verse 21. Behold, I will take the sons of Israel from among the nations where they have gone, and I will gather them from every side and bring them into their own land. So here they are. So we're bringing back into a land. That's one part of the reversal of ceasing to exist, right? And then, verse 22, and I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountain of Israel. And here's that theme again, right? Right here, one king will be king over all of them, and they will no longer be two nations. They will no longer be divided into two kingdoms, and they will no longer defile themselves with idols or with detestable things. I'll deliver them from all their dwelling places which they've sinned, and will cleanse them, and they will be my people, and I will be their God and king, and my servant David will be king over them. And they'll have one shepherd. Notice the emphasis on one. And they will walk in my ordinances and keep my statutes and observe them. And they'll express covenant relationship, everlasting covenant, verse 26. And in other places like this, there's this discussion. Once this rethronement takes place, then we have the life, the water of life. By the way, that comes later in Ezekiel chapter 47. The water that flows from the throne and extends and becomes that river, trees of life growing on each side, bringing healing to the nations, and all of that language. Yeah, that comes later. but it starts with God being rethroned as king and God's people representing the name, the reputation of God through obedience. And I can draw my heart with feet, but I'll say that for later. And then extension of life and blessings to the nations around. And all of that basically gets started all over again. So this is the ongoing kind of picture. And when we get into our kind of this extended period, so Judges, the dark days of Judges, in a way, I mean, we've got some high points. We'll eventually get to King David, which is a high point, obviously. But even then, we're going to see David with warts and all. And then after that, we go quickly through Solomon into this divided kingdom. And I'll tell you right now, I'll give you the punchline up front. In Israel, in the northern kingdom, guess how many kings have a positive evaluation from the author? In the northern kingdom? 0. Goose egg. None. It's just an ongoing situation from the book of Judges. Everybody doing what was right in his own eyes. Although the author of Kings doesn't give us the thesis statement again, that comes from Judges, but we may as well say, this God is not on his throne. Everybody is doing what is right, whatever was right in their own eyes, just continues on in Israel, and we'll find out why. But then in the southern kingdom, in Judah, thankfully we have a few reforming kings that come along, some good kings. And how many approximately do you think are evaluated positively in the southern kingdom in Judah? About 8. Yeah. 8 receive a positive evaluation. But even that's warts and all. In other words, there's no perfect earthly king. Ever. And guess what the prophets start to do? People start to get a little discouraged. The faithful remnant say, we've got a bad king. What's going to happen to us? You know? And the prophets start to say, well, there's one solution that we know of. They already know it. We know that the day of the Lord's coming, and God will be on his throne again. And when he establishes his kingdom, God's people will get their act together, and with their renewed hearts express covenant relationship. And guess what will happen? The water will get turned on. Right? The living water will flow, and the nations of the world would be blessed. And that was the encouragement of the day for the prophets. They're always going to have that basic message. And okay. Thought you had a question there. All right, on that note, and that's kind of the picture here. It kind of brings together, and this is where C.S. Lewis got his inspiration for the lion. By the way, Aslan is the lion, kind of, he's God, right? Okay, all right. So you see the water flowing down from the God who's on his throne, and people from the nations stream walking up, right, to Zion. That's an upward walk, and we'll look at that more. But the fruit from the trees, that's Ezekiel's contribution, the trees of life offering fruit and healing and all of that. So this is the basic picture. And that's the picture that emerges parallel to this history, this historical period of kingly chaos. God begins to raise up prophets. Unfortunately, we can't talk fully about the prophets as we're talking about this history, but it's all kind of happening together. But I'll try to remind you along the way where these prophets kind of fall into place as we get to, and we'll look at them in the next semester in more detail. So let's do this. Let's take our first break of the morning. Let's go for about 10 minutes, and we'll come back and pick up where we left off. All right?